She was left with a baby in a cold barn until a silent cowboy rescued them. The wind howled through the gaps in the barn's weathered planks like the wails of lost souls, carrying with it the bitter cold of a Wyoming winter that seemed determined to freeze the very marrow in Sarah Mitchell's bones. She pulled the thin horse blanket tighter around herself and her 3-day-old daughter Mary, whose tiny fists had turned an alarming shade of blue despite being pressed against Sarah's chest. 3 days. It had been 3 days since Thomas had collapsed in the field, clutching his chest as his face turned the color of ash. 3 days since the banker, Mr. Henley, had arrived with his papers and his cold smile, informing her that the mortgage was in default, and she had until sundown to vacate the premises. 3 days since she'd stumbled into this abandoned barn, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a baby who needed warmth she couldn't provide. The snow had been falling steadily since yesterday, piling against the barn door in drifts that would soon make escape impossible. Sarah's stomach cramped with hunger, a gnawing emptiness that seemed to echo in the hollow spaces between her ribs. She hadn't eaten since before Mary's birth, and her body was failing her when she needed it most. "Hush now, little one," she whispered against Mary's forehead, feeling the baby's weak cries vibrate against her chest. The sound was getting fainter, and Sarah knew with a mother's terrible instinct that time was running out. "Mama's here. Mama's not going anywhere." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were lies. The cold was seeping into her bones now, making her thoughts sluggish and her movements clumsy. She'd tried to keep Mary warm by walking the length of the barn, but her legs had grown too weak to support her weight. Now she sat in the corner where the wind couldn't reach them directly, surrounded by moldy hay that smelled of mice and neglect. Outside, she could hear the storm intensifying. The barn shuddered with each gust, and she found herself wondering if the structure would hold. Built sometime in the last decade by homesteaders who'd long since moved on or died, it had seen better days. The roof leaked in 3 places that she'd counted, though the snow was falling too heavily now to melt and drip through. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember Thomas's face, the way he'd looked when he held Mary for the first and only time. He'd been so proud, so full of plans for their future. They were going to expand the farm, maybe get some cattle, build a proper house instead of the soddy they'd been living in. All those dreams buried now under 6 feet of Wyoming dirt and a simple wooden cross that bore only his name and the dates that bookended his too short life. The baby stirred weakly, and Sarah looked down at the tiny face that was so perfectly Thomas's daughter. Mary had his stubborn chin and the same cowlick that made her dark hair stand up at odd angles. She deserved better than this, better than dying in a freezing barn because her mother had nowhere else to go. "I'm sorry, baby girl," Sarah whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks almost as soon as they fell. "I tried. God knows I tried." The wind screamed again, and this time something answered it, a sound that made Sarah's blood run cold. Wolves. She'd heard them before, distant and haunting, but never this close. They were out there in the storm, probably smelling the same desperation that clung to her like the scent of fear. Sarah fumbled for the rusty pitchfork she'd found earlier, though she doubted she had the strength to use it effectively. Her hands were numb now, barely able to grip the wooden handle. But she would try. For Mary, she would try to fight until her last breath. The howling grew closer, and Sarah pulled the baby tighter against her chest, whispering every prayer she could remember while the storm raged around their makeshift sanctuary. Dawn came grey and bitter, the storm having blown itself out sometime in the pre-dawn hours. Sarah had dozed fitfully, waking every few minutes to check that Mary was still breathing, still warm against her chest. The baby had grown frighteningly quiet during the night, no longer crying, barely moving. Sarah knew this was not a good sign. Her own body felt like it belonged to someone else, distant and unresponsive. When she tried to stand, her legs buckled immediately. sending her back to the hay-covered floor with a jarring impact that made Mary stir weakly. The pitchfork lay beside her, where it had fallen from her nerveless fingers hours ago. Through the gaps in the barn walls, she could see that the snow had stopped, but the world outside looked like something from a fairy tale. Everything buried under pristine white drifts that sparkled in the weak morning sunlight. Beautiful and deadly. The temperature had dropped even further during the night, and frost covered every surface inside the barn. Sarah's lips were cracked and bleeding, her throat so dry she could barely swallow. She'd tried eating some of the hay earlier, but it only made her more nauseous. Her body was consuming itself now, burning whatever reserves it had left to keep her alive long enough to keep Mary warm. The sound came so suddenly that at first she thought she was hallucinating. Hoofbeats, slow and steady, crunching through the snow outside the barn. Sarah's heart began to race, adrenaline cutting through the fog of exhaustion and hypothermia. It could be anyone. Wolves didn't make sounds like that, but men could be just as dangerous, especially to a woman alone with a baby. The footsteps stopped directly outside the barn door. Sarah heard the soft nicker of a horse, then the creak of leather as someone dismounted, heavy boots in the snow, moving around the perimeter of the barn. Whoever it was, they were being cautious, probably trying to determine if the building was occupied. Sarah clutched Mary closer and tried to make herself smaller in the corner. The pitchfork was too far away to reach without making noise, and she wasn't sure she could lift it anyway. All she could do was wait and pray that whoever was out there would move on without investigating further. A board creaked under pressure from outside, and she realized the stranger was testing the walls, looking for a way in. The main door was blocked by snowdrifts, but there were other gaps, places, where the wood had warped or rotted away. Sarah held her breath as the footsteps moved methodically around the structure. Then silence. Long minutes of it, broken only by the distant sound of wind in the trees and the occasional snort from the horse. Sarah began to hope that the stranger had moved on, decided the barn wasn't worth investigating. But then she heard it, the soft scrape of wood against wood, as someone began clearing away the snow from the door. Panic fluttered in her chest, like a trapped bird. She looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the barn was mostly empty, except for some broken farming equipment and piles of rotting hay. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run, even if she'd had the strength. The door groaned as it was forced open just wide enough for a person to slip through. A shadow fell across the patch of sunlight that spilled through the opening, and Sarah saw the silhouette of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in darkness. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, and Sarah was certain he could hear her heart hammering against her ribs. Then he stepped fully into the barn, and she got her first clear look at him. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His eyes, when they found her in the corner, were the color of storm clouds, gray and unreadable. He wore a thick sheepskin coat over worn leather chaps, and a gun belt sat low on his hips. For a moment, they stared at each other across the dim interior of the barn. Sarah clutched Mary so tightly that the baby made a small sound of protest, the first sound she'd made in hours. The stranger's eyes flicked down to the bundle in Sarah's arms, and something changed in his expression, though she couldn't quite read what it was. "Mom," he said finally, his voice rough from the cold and disuse. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed automatic, ingrained by years of frontier courtesy. Sarah tried to speak, to tell him to leave them alone, but all that came out was a harsh croak. Her throat was too dry, her body too weak. She could only watch as he took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was approaching a frightened animal. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice gentler now. The stranger, Jacob, he'd finally told her his name after she'd asked 3 times, moved with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to handling emergencies. He'd taken one look at Sarah and Mary, muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse or a prayer, and immediately set about building a fire in the old barrel stove he'd found buried under debris in the corner. "Chimney's still good," he said, more to himself than to her, as he fed kindling into the firebox. "Seen smoke from it before, figured someone might be using this place." Sarah watched him work, still not. Entirely convinced this wasn't some fever dream brought on by cold and hunger. Jacob moved like a shadow, never wasting a motion, never speaking unless it was necessary. His hands, she noticed, were steady and sure as he coaxed flame from tinder, then carefully fed the growing fire with strips of wood he split from broken boards with a small hatchet from his saddlebags. Within minutes, blessed warmth began to radiate from the stove, and Sarah felt tears of relief freeze on her cheeks. Mary stirred against her chest, making soft, mewling sounds that were the most beautiful music Sarah had ever heard. "When did you last eat?" Jacob asked, glancing over his shoulder at her as he continued feeding the fire. I don't remember," Sarah admitted. "Before she was born, maybe 4 days ago." Jacob's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He stood and walked back to where his horse waited patiently outside the barn door, returning with saddlebags that looked well stocked. From them he produced a tin of crackers, some jerked beef, and a small pot that he filled with snow and set on top of the stove. "Need to get some warmth in you both before we move," he said, settling back on his heels to tend the fire. "Storm's passed, but there's another one coming. Can smell it in the air." "Move." Sarah's voice was still barely above a whisper. I don't have anywhere to go." Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something flicker in those grey eyes. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "Got a place," he said simply. "Not much, but it's warm and dry." Sarah wanted to ask why he was helping her, what he wanted in return, but the words wouldn't come. She'd learned the hard way that kindness in the territories usually came with a price, and she had nothing left to pay with except her life and Mary's. As if reading her thoughts, Jacob said, "Don't want nothing from you. Just can't leave a woman and baby to freeze." He paused, stirring the melting snow in the pot with a stick. "Had a sister once. She'd have been about your age." The way he said "had" told Sarah everything she needed to know about his sister's fate, and something in her chest loosened slightly. She understood loss, understood the way it could drive a person to acts of unexpected mercy. The water came to a boil, and Jacob carefully poured it into a tin cup, then crumbled some of the crackers into it to make a thin gruel. "Can you hold this?" he asked, offering her the cup. Sarah's hands shook so badly she could barely grip it, but the warmth seeping through the metal was like a blessing. She sipped carefully, letting the warm liquid soothe her raw throat. It tasted like nothing and everything at the same time, like salvation in a tin cup. "What's her name?" Jacob asked, nodding toward the baby. "Mary," Sarah managed between sips. "Mary Elizabeth. Pretty name." He was checking his gear now, organizing things with the same methodical precision he'd shown in building the fire. "How far along is she?" 3 days. Born the night my husband." She couldn't finish the sentence. Jacob nodded as if he understood. "You been on your own since then?" "The bank. They took the farm. Said Thomas owed more than we knew." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "I had nowhere else to go." "Banks," Jacob said, and there was enough bitterness in his voice to curdle milk. "They're like vultures, picking over the bones of decent folks." As the fire warmed the barn, Sarah felt strength slowly returning to her limbs, Jacob moved about with quiet purpose. He fashioned a makeshift sling from a horse blanket to help her carry Mary, then helped her to her feet when she felt strong enough to try standing. "My place is about 5 miles north," he said, supporting her weight as she swayed on unsteady legs. "Cabin's not much to look at, but it's got a good roof and walls that don't let the wind through." "Why are you doing this?" Sarah asked, the question finally finding its way past her lips. Jacob was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Maybe because nobody did it for my sister when she needed it. Maybe because it's the right thing to do." He looked at her, and for just a moment, his guard dropped enough for her to see the pain he carried. Maybe because everybody deserves a chance to see another sunrise. He helped her onto his horse, a sturdy bay mare with kind eyes, then handed Mary up to her before swinging up behind. Them both. The warmth of his body against her back was almost overwhelming after so many hours of bitter cold, and Sarah had to bite her lip to keep from crying with relief. As they rode away from the barn, Sarah looked back once at the place where she'd almost died, where she'd almost lost everything. Then she turned her face forward toward whatever uncertain future awaited them, and held her daughter close. Jacob's cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by pine trees that blocked the worst of the wind, their branches heavy with snow that sparkled like diamonds in the afternoon sun. It was small, just 2 rooms and a lean-to for storage, but it looked solid and well-maintained, with smoke rising from a stone chimney and windows that glowed yellow with lamplight. "Built it myself," Jacob said as he helped Sarah down from the horse, his words forming white clouds in the cold air. "Took me 3 summers, working between jobs." Sarah clutched Mary against her chest and looked around the clearing. There was a small barn for the horse, a well with a hand pump, and what looked like a root cellar built into the hillside. Everything spoke of careful planning and hard work, of a man who'd found his place in the world and intended to stay. Inside, the cabin was Spartan but comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a wood-burning stove for cooking nearby. A simple table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the main room, while a narrow bed was pushed against the far wall. The second room, barely more than an alcove, contained another bed and some storage shelves. "You can have the back room," Jacob said, setting his saddlebags on the table. "I'll take the main room. Fire's better out here anyway." Sarah sank into one of the chairs, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The warmth of the cabin was almost overwhelming after the bitter cold of the barn, and she felt Mary relax against her chest for the first time in days. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for what he'd done, what he was doing. Jacob busied himself stoking the fire, then put a pot of water on the stove. "You'll need to clean up," he said without looking at her. "Baby too. Got some soap and clean rags." Sarah nodded, though the thought of undressing in the cold made her shiver. Jacob seemed to understand her hesitation because he disappeared into the back room and returned with an armload of blankets and what looked like men's clothing. "Shirts might be big on you, but they're clean and warm," he said, still not meeting her eyes. "I'll step outside while you get yourselves sorted." The consideration in his voice, the careful way he avoided looking at her, it was the behavior of a gentleman, something Sarah hadn't expected from a lone cowboy living in the middle of nowhere. But then, Jacob seemed full of surprises. Once he'd gone outside, Sarah carefully undressed Mary and herself, using the warm water he'd provided to wash away days of fear and desperation. The baby responded well to the warmth, her tiny fists unclenching for the first time since they'd left the farm. Her color was better too, Sarah noticed with relief. Less blue, more pink. Jacob's shirt hung on her like a tent, but it was clean and soft from many washings, and it smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke. She found herself breathing it in, finding comfort in the scent of safety and warmth. When Jacob returned, he'd brought fresh milk from somewhere. Sarah hadn't seen any cattle, but she didn't ask questions. He heated it carefully and showed her how to feed Mary with a cloth dipped in the warm liquid, a technique that seemed to come naturally to him. "You've done this before," Sarah observed, watching his gentle hands as he helped position the cloth so Mary could suck on it. "My sister had a baby," Jacob said quietly, before things went bad. Helped her some with the feeding when the little one wouldn't take to nursing right away." There was pain in his voice, old and deep, and Sarah didn't push for more details. Everyone in the territories had losses they carried, secrets they kept. She understood the need for silence around certain wounds. As evening approached, Jacob prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork, with biscuits he'd made that morning. Sarah found herself eating ravenously, her body finally remembering what it meant to be fed and warm. Mary slept peacefully in her arms, making soft sounds of contentment that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "She'll be fine," Jacob said, noticing her tears. "Babies are tougher than they look, and you did good, keeping her warm all that time." "I thought we were going to die," Sarah admitted. "In that barn, when the storm was worst, I thought that was it." Jacob poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks up the chimney. "Death's got a way of passing by when you're not ready for it," he said. "Lost count of how many times I should have died but didn't. Makes you wonder what you're supposed to stick around for. Do you ever figure it out? What you're supposed to stick around for?" Jacob glanced at her, then at Mary sleeping in her arms. "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes it gets clearer." That night, Sarah lay in the narrow bed in the back room, listening to the wind in the pines and the soft sounds of Jacob moving around in the main room. For the first time in days, she felt safe enough to truly sleep, to let go of the vigilance that had kept her alive through the worst night of her life. But even as she drifted off, she wondered what would happen tomorrow and the day after that. Jacob had saved them, but she couldn't stay here forever, couldn't impose on his kindness indefinitely. She had no money, no family, no skills beyond keeping house and helping with farm work. In the harsh mathematics of frontier survival, she and Mary were liabilities, mouths to feed with no way to contribute. Still, for tonight they were warm and safe and alive. Tomorrow's problems could wait until tomorrow. Tonight, it was enough to listen to her daughter's peaceful breathing and know that they had survived. 3 weeks passed in a routine that felt both foreign and natural to Sarah. She woke each morning to the sound of Jacob splitting wood outside, the rhythmic thunk of his axe marking time like a heartbeat. By the time she'd dressed and fed Mary, he'd have the fire built up and coffee brewing, filling the cabin with warmth and the rich scent that meant safety and home. Jacob, she'd learned, was a man of few words but consistent actions. He rose before dawn every day to tend his few head of cattle and check the snares he'd set for rabbits. He never complained about the extra mouths to feed, never made her feel like a burden. But Sarah could see the way he stretched their supplies, making every meal count, every resource last a little longer. "I need to earn my keep," she told him one morning, as he prepared to ride out to check on his cattle. "I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I'm not useless." Jacob paused in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Never said you were useless. But you're feeding us, housing us, and getting nothing in return. It's not fair to you." "Fair's got nothing to do with it," Jacob said, settling his hat on his head. "You do what needs doing, that's all." But Sarah could see the truth in the way he counted out beans for dinner, the way he made the coffee weaker to make it last longer. She was costing him more than he could afford, and they both knew it. That afternoon, while Jacob was out checking his traps, Sarah bundled Mary up and walked to the small barn where he kept his tools. If she couldn't contribute money, she could at least contribute work. She found his spare clothes in need of mending, tears and worn spots that spoke of hard use and careful maintenance. By the time he returned, she'd mended 3 shirts and was working on patching his winter coat. Jacob stopped in the doorway when he saw her, his expression unreadable. "Didn't need to do that," he said quietly. "I needed to do something," Sarah replied, not looking up from her stitching. "I can't just sit here letting you take care of us without giving something back." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, watching her work. Then he said, "Rabbit stew for dinner. Caught 2 good ones today." It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it wasn't rejection either. Sarah took it as permission to be useful, to find her place in the careful balance of their temporary arrangement. Over the following days, she gradually took over more of the household tasks. She cooked their meals, washed their clothes in the icy stream behind the cabin, and kept the fire going while Jacob was out working. Mary grew stronger and more alert, her tiny personality beginning to emerge in gurgles and focused stares that followed movement around the room. "She's got your eyes," Jacob observed one evening as he watched Sarah feed the baby. "Same color, same shape, but—" "Thomas's stubborn chin," Sarah replied, smiling down at her daughter. "She's going to be trouble, this one." "Good kind of trouble," Jacob said, and there was something in his voice that made Sarah look up at him. He was watching them both with an expression she couldn't quite read. Longing, maybe, or loss, or something else entirely. "Jacob," she began, then stopped. She'd been about to ask about his sister, about the baby he'd mentioned, but the closed look that crossed his face warned her off. "Getting cold," he said instead, rising to add more wood to the fire. "Storm coming tomorrow, maybe the next day. Can smell it." The storm, when it came, was worse than the one that had nearly killed them in the barn. For 2 days, the wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, rattling the windows and sending snow down the chimney in occasional puffs that hissed against the fire. But inside, they were warm and safe, with enough food to last and walls that kept out more than just the wind. On the second night of the storm, as they sat by the fire listening to the wind, Sarah finally found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. "What happens when spring comes?" Jacob poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. "Spring's still a long way off. But when it does come, I can't stay here forever, Jacob. It's not right, and you know it." Jacob was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it over the wind. "Had a wife once," he said. "Long time ago, before I came here. She died having our baby. Both of them gone in one night, and me not able to do nothing about it." Sarah's heart clenched at the pain in his voice. "Jacob, I'm sorry. I didn't know." "No reason you should." He set the poker aside and looked directly at her for the first time in days. "Point is, I know what it's like to be alone. Know what it's like to lose. Everything that matters. Can't change what happened to me, but maybe I can change what happens to you." "What are you saying?" Jacob stood and walked to the window, looking out at the storm-white world beyond. "Saying maybe we could help each other. You need a place to stay, a way to take care of your daughter. I need—" He paused, his shoulders tense. "I need to stop living like a man with one foot in the grave." Sarah felt her heart begin to race. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking. If you'd consider it. Not for love, not yet anyway. For practical reasons. For survival." He turned to face her, and she could see the vulnerability he was trying to hide. "I can provide for you both. Give Mary a name and a future. In return, you'd have a home, security. We'd be partners, taking care of each other." Sarah looked down at Mary, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then back at Jacob. He was offering her everything she needed: safety, security, a future for her daughter. But marriage, without love, marriage as a business arrangement, was that enough? "I need time to think," she said finally. Jacob nodded. "Take all the time you need." "But Sarah?" He met her eyes across the firelit room. "You're not alone anymore. Whatever you decide, you're not alone." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The walls that had kept out the cold and wind had also kept something in, the possibility of a new beginning, fragile as a newborn's first breath, but real enough to build a life on. Sarah held her daughter close and watched the fire dance in the hearth, thinking about the future and the choices that would define it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make. But tonight, for the first time since Thomas died, she felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope.